All right, welcome everyone at the Multi-Networking Community Sync meeting. Today is May 3rd, and yeah, let's continue our discussion on the multi-networking support in Kubernetes. Shane, to repo idea. Oh,
yeah, we talked about it before. I just kind of wondered if it seemed like maybe that
so
idea
what
petered out.
happened is I did this. I did a private on my private fork of KK. I created a branch with the initial
Okay, I
version
missed
of
this.
this. Yes, sorry, you might have missed that. There was some 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago.
Yeah,
I
I
think
missed
someone.
that meeting or something.
So we don't have a repository per se right now, but I'm thinking that branch will be the best because then we can work directly on the KK repo. And do stuff rather than just going with the CRD. So there is an initial version of the pod network. At that time, it's not updated. So I probably my next update on this, or if you wish to just create a PR or push a change against that branch of mine, then feel free to do that. But basically, yeah. Look at it. I think someone mentioned that it compiled. I didn't compile it. I just managed to add the code itself because there is not much to it, right? I just add a definition of the CRD, and that's it. So my next step when we're gonna finalize the discussion on on the how the pod should be linked, referenced, how we should do that reference. That my next step will be to add an additional comments to do that part, right? To have kind of a proper functionality there that we can at least reference the pod. That will be kind of my next step. But if anything, by the way, this is as well feel free to create PRs against that. I think that's possible. I am a novice in terms of GitHub, so I was said that this is possible to create even a PR against a private repository. So feel free to do that, and if you need to do some changes. All right. I think Shane, that's any other questions on that repo stuff?
No, that answered my question. I think I missed a meeting because there was a conflict, so I just
Mm,
missed that. I have that bookmarked now. Thank you.
okay. All right. So any other topics? If not, then let's jump right into that one then. So I had a thought about last week we stopped on the default network and how would we deal with ability to migrate the default network during upgrade from one CNI to another. And I think I have an idea. And I will get to it. But before that, what I would like to kind of introduce to the object is an ability to indicate that the object is used by any of the pod. So basically to indicate that something is using the pod, and that will give us a signal saying, okay, this pod is in use. And for example, you cannot just easily delete that object because it's being in use by some pod. And I would not want to do a case where I can create a pod network, create a pod attaching to that, and then I can easily delete the pod network. That I think we should not be allowed. We should not do. We should prevent against that. So I am thinking. My idea, and please bear with me, is to do it via a condition. I'm not sure this is the best way to do it. I have completely no. I don't think there is any like example, a template in Kubernetes API to do something similar, unless I'm mistaken. And basically, if anyone has some better idea because of some experience in some other projects, please let me know. I'm just trying to do it through conditions. So basically, I'm thinking of introduce a new condition which would say basically that the pod network is referenced by at least one pod, and basically then it cannot be deleted. So in use, this condition will be handled by the here. This condition will be handled by the KCM controller that we will have to have anyway for the pod network. And basically it will see as soon as any pod tries to reference the pod and is successful to do that, we will set this condition to true. If the last pod removes the reference attachment, then this will switch back to false. Any comments to this? Any other ideas maybe to this? How other ideas on how we could kind of indicate this? I take the silence as a agreement, and that's a good idea. Is that okay? So yeah, Tom.
So this means the KCM is just a counting of the with how many pod is using this network internally or some stuff, and then then changing is the in use to.
So how that's going to be implemented, that's I'm leave that to the implementation, Tomo. However,
but sorry, this should be implemented in the upstream Kubernetes, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. Whenever I mean KCM, this is core, the kube control manager. So that will be in core. Yes, definitely. That's what I mean. Yes, because this object is core. So it's not like if I would mention anything that implementation handles it, then that's what it is. If I mention a specific controller, that means it's a part of the core Kubernetes. So yes, that will be handled.
So I'm so the how that. So maybe that this I'm not understanding why we need the in use field.
Mm-hmm.
I mean that how do I say? Maybe that we just the KCM manager is keeping this stuff internally, and
mm-hmm.
then if someone is used, that time just keep the KCM just rejecting the deletions as the
so every time you would try to delete, let's see that use case, Tomo. Every time I try to delete an object, KCM has to go and do a list on all the pods, calculate whether any pod referencing this object, which is constant. And every time I do delete, so basically I can overkill, overload my my control plane node just by doing delete pod, and basically spamming that. You see?
Okay, KCM is just the server, right? So the server can keeping the how many the association. Not
no, that's expensive, Tom. Just doing it for every delete, that's expensive.
No.
There should be a flag.
I mean that not calculate every time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just mentioned that the so Kubernetes, so KCM is just a daemon of the at the Unix daemon. Then this running and then keeping the internal server variable. Right?
No, Domo, that's not how it works. That's why you want to indicate that on the object. And additionally, Tomo, the other reason is
maybe
we're discussing
maybe how about adding there some counter how many pod is using.
So
maybe
counter
more easier, and then also it's easy to get the user how many pod is used. Sometimes the administrator wants to know how many pod is using this network, like the.
So Tomo, we didn't get to observability.
Okay, let's imagine. Let's imagine that. Let's imagine that yep. So let's imagine that the network administrator tried to removing this stuff, and then sometimes this network is in use, and then the administrator wants to know how many pod is using, and sometimes they may try to port their understanding, and then okay, let's imagine network administrator is found there some 2 pod is still attaching, and then they removed, but at that time they're still in use. At that time, the administrator wants to know how many pod.
All right. So let me tell you this, Tomo. Observability pieces, metrics, is a separate story. All right. In observability, when we're going to touch on that part, we will say I don't want to know how many pods are used. I want to know all the data, right? I want to know for each pod network, I want to know how much, how many pods is using this specific pod network. So we will get to the story of that, and that's completely separate. And I'm not saying in-use going to replace it, just having two. And basically, what you're referring to is Prometheus, or other means to expose metric. I'm saying Prometheus is one of the implementations, but this is basically what you're referring to are metrics, which KCM, I'm not familiar so much with KCM. I hope it has some basic metrics exposed already, and we will just add another one that will say pods in number of pods per pod network used, and that's completely separate.
But this means the using the metrics that we do not need these conditions.
No metrics, and Tomo, we cannot have controllers. Let's say I want to have a controller to indicate, oh, is this network in use for my own personal use, for my implementation of CC of this multi-networking capability. I don't want to rely on metrics on my controller to kind of grab them to indicate what's in use. I want to have a flag.
I think that Tomo is saying that if you're going to track it as a enumerated or a Boolean, then it's no more expensive to track it as an integer value, is what I'm hearing. But the thing I am confused about is, and back this up for me for just a second, guys, is there's a mention of calculating this on delete being too expensive, but I am curious how we would detect it's no longer in use anymore, or is that not the case? Does it only go into use and then it never comes out of use?
No. It comes out of use when all the pods are deleted. So what would have to happen is on pod creation or pod delete, you would then do the list and calculate who's using me or not.
Okay.
That's one of the approaches.
Then I misunderstood it. So for these condition types, if there is ready, params ready, in use, if it's no longer in use, it goes back to one of the other two states?
No, those are not states. Okay, so conditions. Those three conditions are, okay, how conditions work. This is a list, all right? Considering this is a list, so basically I have all those conditions at once. So at the same time, I have all three of them. This is not like they transition between these. Each three are independent, but like ready would be dependent on params ready. So basically ready will be only when params ready is set if you defined it. And then in use is completely independent because, but it's in the same time, all three are
the
there.
Absence of the in-use condition means
it will be always there. I don't think it should be at any point it should not be there. So
what happens if a pod network is not in use at all? Like we would have just ready and params ready for that specific one?
Oh yeah. This is independent. So those two report what is if the object is ready itself. So basically, ready means that there is a whole description over here that doesn't change. So basically readiness means all the fields that I deem valid are valid, and if let's say there is a delete in progress, so basically to deem to deem that, oh, someone's trying to delete the object but it's being in use, right? So basically I will set the ready not true, and then say a specific reason. Or for example, I created the object, but I'm referencing an object, then I expect the controller of that object to set my params ready flag. If I don't have this set, then I set my ready is not set. And it has nothing to do with the in use. The in use then is just to indicate that this object is referenced by something else, and then I can do some other actions based on that. Did I answer, Daniel, your question?
Yeah, thank you.
And if I understand it, then the absence of the in use condition means it hasn't been used.
There is that as well, yes. So keep in mind that if I'm not mistaken, how conditions are handled on, let's say, pod, as soon as you create the pod, the conditions are added by the KCM or whatever controllers there are. So basically what's going to happen on creation of the object, the controller that's going to handle this object is the first thing he's going to do is set the default values for those two conditions that it handles. So basically it will right away create those two conditions, ready and in use, to say that, let's say, ready will be by default set as a false, and then in use will be set as false as well on the very beginning, right? As it probably can even happen like in the mutating, it's as if it was a mutating webhook during creation, right? What is the pattern exactly here? I'm not so familiar with the KCM to kind of say that. I would have to look at the nodes and pods, how they are handled, how the conditions there are handled. But basically what you're saying, yes, if the condition is not there, means the controller didn't look at this object yet, and basically indicate the worst case scenario. So basically, or in this case, in use is not used because there is no pod referencing, but basically the object is not ready, so you should not use it at all. So there is that as well. So of course, unless your implementation is going to use it right away, even regardless of whether it's ready, I would consider that's incorrect implementation, but that's up to the implementation itself.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks, Maciej. That helps me understand the conditions here better, which clearly I didn't understand well. So I appreciate that.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So, and I'm bringing here like the standard. It's not something that I'm doing something new here. This is the standard default. I've, at least for condition state, this is the default pattern that I'm copying pasting from all the other objects. Though they use like a node.
Yeah,
node
part of my problem was I didn't read that meta v1 dot condition field.
Yeah. So basically, this is basically nothing new here. This is standard. The only thing I'm thinking to do it through, I want to have an indication on the object that says that I'm in use. The number of pods using it is a metric status, and it will be there as well. If your implementation rather wants to rely on that metric, it's freely to you. The thing here is with the metrics, they might not be reflected. I'm not sure how the implementation is usually done for such things inside KCM. So in terms of metrics, they might not be event driven the way you would think, where as soon as something changes, it will just right away change the metric because it might be too costly. So maybe that can be delayed by a few seconds or even few minutes. So that's why metrics are not fully reliable here, might not be fully reliable. And that's my speculation here. Maybe the implementation can be done, or KCM implements in such a way that it's event driven and it's right away updated. But I don't know that one. So I prefer to definitely want to have a flag saying it's in use or not, like a global statement that there are some pods using it. The exact number will be metrics for that. Tomo, did that kind of makes you kind of is that understandable? Is that okay? Yeah, you're muted now if you want to say something. All right, if you have other questions to that, Tomo, let me know. Moving on now to the problem of the default network and how we would transition. So what I'm thinking to do is automatic creation, manual network migration. Basically, I am thinking of this problem as what we have in one of our requirements. In one of our requirements, we have an need for ability to override the namespace-based default network. So basically in the specific namespace, I want to say, okay, the default network will be not the default one, but something else, my network blah. And kind of that gave me idea, why can't we not do this on a per node basis? And if we do it on the per node basis, that basically solves the whole thing. Then your installer, I think someone was mentioning that last week, that the installer will do something on the node on a per node pool basis. But with this, we can do it on a per node basis. And what the installer would do is during installation, during the upgrade process of your installation of the platform installer, it would the updated node will be put in a maintenance mode, and then before unlocking that node, we would override put a value in this field of the node. That's my idea right now. The name would be override default pod network. It will be in a spec of the node. When you set a value there, kubelet will default to that value, not the default network, when assigning a pod network, when pod network doesn't have any networks, to a specific pod that lands on a specific node. So basically that's how we do that. The thing here is what I'm a bit, and I'm looking for some ideas or some concerns. What about the permissions of changing this? So that's my because you should be able to easily add a pod network, set this field or unset it. That should be without any restrictions, be able to do that. Per?
Yeah, so okay, so the two parts. One is, I mean, we have many nodes, right? How this can be done. I mean, you can coordinate and empty and I mean change it and move things back, right? And I think that's what you described. And then you have the odd case when you have a one node cluster, sort of just have to describe. I mean, if we say that it's not possible, you'll have to take all the load off and change it and take it up, bring it up again. So be it, right? But
you still have to delete the pods that you have on your one node cluster, right? How would you do it?
Yeah, exactly. The question is just, will you run with the old and the new at the same time?
Oh yeah. So what you're saying? So basically,
first let the old one die off and then start new ones. I mean,
yeah, something like that. So basically, I'm giving you the tool how you can handle it. So either in a single node, that's a tricky because you would delete all the. I would see you delete all the pods anyway to upgrade your kubelet and do all the operations. So you have to recreate the pods anyway. So maybe during that process, you can delete then the default network. So that's another change. What I'm thinking to this, just to
I think, I mean, everyone. I mean, this is from writing standards before. We should just write it loosely enough so that it should be okay to basically kill all the pods, change network, start all the pods again. Or if you have some idea how to do it, when you have a case that actually the two networks can work together, right? That you can do a transition. I think it just means it's written that both are okay from an implementation. Then of course each implementation needs to decide what the hell to do. But let's not just write it so that there is no way that you first would kill all the pods and switch, right? That should be permitted.
Yeah. So. One thing that I am removing from the list of rules for the default network is the network can never be deleted. Right now, this bullet is gone. What it means is it applies to the standard characteristics of the pod. Cannot be removed when at least one pod is referencing it. So basically, this applies to the default same way. And basically based on that, if I'm doing the transition, if no pod is using my default network, then now I can delete it. And now I can create a new default network with my new values. This of course can only happen when either all my pods are host networked and nothing is using my my default network, or I set on every of my node in my cluster, I set this override default pod network to some other value. And basically all the pods now are running on this pod network, not the default one. And then I can delete my current default and create a new one with the new values. Probably copy the one that I'm using in this field, so that yeah, that I can transition basically to that, and basically they will be exactly the same for some period of time when the whole life cycle is there. And then at one point I can, when I have my default set, I can clear up this field. One conditions for clearing up this field is I'm mentioning here that this field can be cleaned up only when the default network exists. That's something that we definitely want to check. We don't want to kind of put maybe no, that was, I think, did I put it out here for migration process? No, I think that was one of my ideas, but then I reverted on that, sorry. But basically you should be able to mutate this field at will. And then the one other thing is kubelet. When I mentioned here as well that kubelet, so that was in the manual case where kubelets will report now a default pod network not found error if the default network doesn't exist, and that will be behaving and will take into account this field then. And basically, if that field is set as and this will be a override, so this will be having higher priority. So if that field is set and that network doesn't exist, I will say default pod network not found for that node, right? If it's not set, then it will look for the default named network. And if that's not exist, then it will again say this or not, basically. And if you delete that field, that will trigger a local kubelet to say, okay, is there default network? If it's not there, I will start saying that node is not ready because I cannot find default network. So that's what I'm thinking about, like how what is the dynamic of this field against the readiness of the node and presence of the specific networks in the cluster. Perry, you have still your hand. Do you have other questions?
Oh, it didn't come down.
Okay, no worries.
Normally comes down at the
Any other, Tomo, you have a question?
Yep.
Go ahead.
So the yeah, I understand that the override default port network field is used for migration, but so this field is not guarded. I mean that the network administrator or someone they are having admin role can adding the field to forcefully to override default network. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's the kind of concern of mine. Is that a good idea to have this field and do this that way? Probably when we're going to run this by SIG networking, we have more feedback on this. But that's the concern. That's one of the concerns of mine for this idea where, yeah, exactly, someone with the admin power can just break you or override this, right?
Yeah, and then also the how do I say? So so before configuring the override default port network and then after modifying the override default port network, the old port and the newer port may connect to different network.
Yes.
So how network administrator understanding which network that some port is connecting. I mean that.
So keep in mind
at that time the how do I say, we need to I don't know, but maybe the override port network have the timestamp to modify, and then the administrator checking at these time, and then as well as the port creation, and then they identify. But this is not good.
So basically, we are getting to the exact the right topic on this, on how we attach pod network to a pod. And what I'm thinking is this field will be always set. It's not like the field will be there and it will not be set. It will always be set by I think KCM, our pod network controller. What will it be set is, even if you don't specify anything, I will set the default network, and I will set the value that is at that point the default network. So what I mean by that is, if for selected node the default network is, you didn't select any networks, the pod doesn't specify any field over there, we will auto-populate the pod spec with the current default network for the selected node, right? Or even namespace, because there is in the future we are thinking about namespace as well. So that's how you differentiate that. Okay, this pod is using the default network because it was created beforehand, and now this new pod is using the full network because that's the current override, and that's how you would see that.
Wouldn't it just be simpler to assume a default network for the cluster originally? And if the pod doesn't have that that field stated at all or populated, just use the the cluster default network for everything.
I'm sorry, Daniel, I didn't get it.
Yeah, so just let's assume we got a default network for the cluster. I'm not speaking about the nodes. So we wouldn't even need to define that specific field because we would assume that the pod would at least have that field, even if it's not set. We would assume that as a default for any other pod. Just following up with Thomas' way of speaking. So that may also lead. I mean, we got an override for a node. Let's use that one. But otherwise, let's use just the cluster default network for everything. Not sure if I'm clear over there.
But I think we're talking the same thing, Daniel. I'm not sure what you're saying that.
Yeah. So let's basically what I'm saying. Let's not even put it there. I mean, it's maybe it doesn't really hard, but I think it's a little bit of putting everything access there. So let's assume the controller would write that because the KCM would just fetch the default network if nothing is set.
Yes. But then how would I change that on a per node basis?
Yeah, that's my point. So let's assume that if there's anything that per node, then okay, so be it. But by default, the KCM would use just the cluster one, assuming that there's no per node default network.
That's true. Yeah, that's what it will do. Yeah, that's what I think we are saying the same thing. So
anyway, yeah,
let me. So we have a default network, right? That's right now.
Yep.
And basically, whenever I create and we are about to kind of finalize on this topic, so maybe we can move to the attaching stuff. But
yep, totally.
When I applied today a pod that doesn't have any pod networking and nobody cares about it. For example, I have a cluster and I am a web service that I'm deploying, so I don't even care about multi-networking, and that's perfectly fine. Someone applies a pod without any spec for that such thing, but what we will do is in KCM we will update the pod that's such default pod spec with the pods annotation saying, okay, this pod will attach now to at least the default network, and that's what it will. We will be populating the spec, and I'm not sure how much of you are aware. Like for example, there is a field called node name in a pod spec. Node name is a field that you can set yourself, but if it's not set, will trigger the scheduler on the server on the control plane side, which will try to calculate which node a specific pod should go to, and set that field in the pod spec. Even if you didn't set it, then after the pod is running, you can look at the pod spec. There is a field called node name, and it is being set to that node on which it finally landed. Same concept here with this, where if there is no pods defined, means I want to attach to a default pod network. Then basically when the such pod comes, and I will just say, okay, this pod attaches to default network.
Yeah, well, basically the same thing.
Yeah, same thing. So and then if there is a case where okay, now this pod, there will be some casing a bit of here, because if this pod lands on a specific node, okay, scheduler applied it to a specific node, and then that node has the override default pod network field set, then the logic will be to, okay, I will set that network name rather than the other one, rather than the default, sorry. So basically at that point, that's where it will be done like this. That got me thinking as we are discussing this, should this field, and this is kind of to deal with the kind of security of this field, should we maybe allow setting, and I'm kind of throwing an idea here, should we maybe allow setting the value? So basically going from empty to some value only when the node is in, let's say, maintenance mode. I'm not sure. I think there is a standardized ways on how to put basically when the node when the node is put in cordon state or draining state or something like that. I would have to look at up whether there is a standard way to put a node in like unschedulable case. Thoughts? And maybe then this will be the only way, this will be the only state. So you can only set a value when the node is set into this kind of maintenance mode. And then when and then the only thing will be that I can unset the value at any point. That is allowed. So going from any value to empty it can happen at any point. But going to a specific value, putting from empty to a value, it's only when the node is in, let's say, in a maintenance mode. Then we will avoid this case Tomo, where I have two pods using by default using different networks. That will that's why that kind of that idea came to me, because then we drain the node. There is no pods on the node, and this is when okay I can except for daemon sets maybe, and now I can change my overrides field, right? Because there is no other pod, so anything coming up will always have this default pod network. Thoughts
maybe,
on that?
So then maybe could you adding the more description in the network migration, I think. So sure. Maybe the override default pod network is how they say. So currently the override default pod network is the how they say. I'm just thinking that the network migration is happened. At that time, the one node adding the override default pod network. Okay, let's call the new temporary default, and then do a migration. And then during the migration, the some pod having the non-default, not the default network attachment. I mean that the temporary default network is used. And after that, the network administrator want to remove the temporary default network. But this cannot be because this temporary default network is in use, because the pod that created during the migration is still launched, right? So maybe the network the after network migration, network administrator wants to adding any temporal resources. I mean that this should be cleaned up before network migration is finished. What do you think about that? So maybe maybe we need to.
I don't think that would be the purpose of this. I think that will be the problem. So if then
maybe the please describe that the scenarios, and then to clarify that this stuff is already care about that. Currently this description is only the mention that the override default pod network is introduced.
Right. So there's another question to this, because this is kind of, we're going into this ability to override networks, and this is part of our later phases. My question is to kind of, for the sake of limiting the scope, should we do this in this phase? This override default pod network. We have some ideas on how to do it, but my questioning, would that be okay for us to punt it to a next phase and just focus on the API and attachments only? Thoughts on that?
So this means the network migration is the advanced topic. I mean that the cluster the version migration or some stuff, sometimes that they may want to migrate some network to network, I think.
So basically,
this should be target. This should be included in the timing we introducing in the pod network, I think. Or maybe we just
what we're asking,
maybe we just adding in the later. So please keep their network until we introduce the migration.
That's what I'm thinking, because right now you don't have to support it, right? You don't have to enable it. This will be set as behind a feature flag. And basically right now we have a ways on how we would create it automatically, or you can set it manually, which is easy. And then later down the road, we will introduce this migration capability where you can now enable this feature in your production clusters, right? I wouldn't imagine someone, after this cap is released and implemented, I wouldn't imagine anyone just now running their clusters with this right away, right? So this will, of course, take time to kind of adapt. So that's why I'm saying maybe for the sake of limiting the scope, we can punt it to later phases. Though we have the idea of what can be, how can this be handled. That's, I think, if anyone now during the cap review, anyone would come and ask us about how that's going to happen, we have an answer, but we will not implement it at that point, right? Because it's something that we can do later on. Thoughts, or is that something that we should have
if you
right away?
If you punt it to the next phase, just remove this stuff. I think we do not need this stuff.
No, we need to definitely mention how that's going to be handled. We definitely have to, maybe not in such a detail, but we need to mention how we are thinking of handling that, and then saying that we will punt it to the next.
Clear that I'm not clear what you mentioned. I mean that
that we were thinking that we have a plan how to handle this.
Once we provide some design, at that time we should conclude. I mean that we should the finishing the design and then putting in the cap. If we do not finishing this design, and then we do not adding, or maybe we just saying network migration is in progress. We just provide in the future. So currently, your description is
exactly.
Design some part.
Don't look at the Tomo at the description. I'm throwing an idea, and the text has to be then changed to what I'm saying. That this is the initial idea, but it will not be part of this cap. That's what it would say. But my question to the group is that okay to punt the migration story to later phases?
If we're gonna punt things, can we start writing that down somewhere? Is that gonna be captured somewhere?
Yeah, definitely. We would capture that, Michael. But we will do that. But my question is there anyone in the group stating that the migration is something a must-have and let's have it right away? That's my question, right? That we cannot live without it, and this has to be from the get-go.
I do think that, I'm sorry for that there's something lacking in the migration, at least in the cap, which is, and please shoot me out if that's outside of the scope of this, but I was wondering, how about if we migrate also to different CNI plugin version? Like that's in that up now, we are using Bricks plugin, and we want to migrate to whatever CNI plugins. That would be another story.
So that's something that exactly do we need to support, right? That's the question, right? Is that something that
because you can have multiple default networks, right?
Let's do with this, default multiple. So we say there is only one. With this currently, if the migration, if the kind of override capability is not there, you cannot have multiple default networks. You can only have one, right? That's what we will say. And my question is that acceptable for the first phase, or we should have ability to overwrite and then make it per node capability too?
I mean, it is one of those places where it starts to get messy with having the multiple defaults.
Exactly.
Should we?
Routing.
Yeah, but some of us want multiple networks, ECMP for redundancy to the API server.
So that's another thing, I think, Michael. The one problem here is with this one is we're talking about just the default, right? Per node. So basically, we would assume that it's not possible.
I have a requirement for each X and each Y in a pod going to 2 different tours to get to everything base and the network hashes via 5 tuple like it's been doing for 30 years.
Sure. So keep in mind that maybe a step back. You're talking about how multi-home will be resolved. That's my guess here. Which this not it. That's not it. We would never have a case where a pod is connected to the default network and my override. That will never happen. That should never happen. It's one or the other only. So my pod always lands with only one network. It's not like I'm going to have a default and then override inside single pod. That's not the point of this. This migration story talks about a single always interface per pod. It's just which one, all right? Because I want to migrate my default from A to B. That's the reason. So I'm not sure why routing is mentioned here. I don't think it should be a concern about that.
So this is a multi-network cap that's forcing us to have one network.
No, Michael, we didn't. We are in a section of folks. Come on, we are in a section of default pod network only. Let's context, please keep the context. We are getting there. Yes, we will gonna talk about how to attach multiple, and then we can talk about what to do inside the pod if we want to. Though I think this is up to the implementation, but let's get to that later on. Right now, in the context of pod network, all right, default pod network, which will always one per node, and when I don't care about multi-networking at all, that's what we're talking about here. And now I want to migrate between CNIs because I am grading or something. That's the use cases right now, at least for the default pod network. We are not in a let's just focus on that for now, and let's move on to the what you're saying. I never said that we forced to a single network. That was never my intention. For default pod network, yes, and this override even states default pod network. It's only for that. I see. I saw 1+1. I see no kind of against. So I think let's try to. I'm not sure how much complicated this might be. My concern, this might be a lot of this field. There is a lot. There might be a lot behind it, which I don't even covered. Some security concerns, some other problems. That's why I might want to maybe punt it to a next cap so that we can focus about it over there rather than here, because there is a lot on this one anyway already. So I think that's current. This kind of, let me add another comment here. And I don't see, are there any objections to that? Okay, none.
Will that be added to the current cap that this network migration is out of scope, or is it just going to be relegated to it?
No,
okay, cool.
No. It will be mentioned. I will keep the text here to kind of provide the idea what we are thinking about this, because see this now. This group is aware of all this, but there will be now reviewers for this cap from SIG networking, and they would say, okay, you're adding this now. How you're going to support this feature? And we already talked about it, and we will say, yeah, the plan is to do this way, but we will handle it in a later phase. This is now just an like alpha version of this, so we will not support that case for now, but in the future we have some ideas. Those are the ideas, but we will cover it later on.
Appreciate, yeah, you getting it added to the cap. I just don't want next week that we just talk about it again in a circular fashion.
No, yeah, I left. Yeah, I see. Yeah, probably will not happen. All right, I think we have the default pod network, most of the cases covered. I think with even the override, it will allow us to configure different CNI per node if you want to, the default one. So I think we kind of killing all the birds with this one stone. So hopefully the pod network is covered. To summarize, default pod network can be deleted if it's not used by any other pod. If you delete it, then your kubelet would report network not ready, node not ready with default pod network not present. Of course, the other rules apply for the default network, that has to be available on all the nodes, and it will be named default. and basically this is what all the other pods will be connecting to if nothing referenced in the pod spec. All right. And there is a way to automatically create the object through KCM based on the arguments of the KCM. This is for the sake of the IPAM, which is related to the IPAM controller inside KCM. And then you can override create a flag where you would create it all on your own. Basically that's that is the kind of summary of the default pod network. All right, I think we have 5 minutes, so just let me introduce to attaching pod networks, and next week you can probably continue discussing on it on your own. So what I'm thinking is follow a bit a concept of the volumes that we have today in the pod. Volumes, the thing with volumes is there are two things to volume. There is a definition of the volume itself, and there is a something like a volume mount or something like that. So basically, the reason because of that is volumes is on a pod level definition of whatever paths I want to have available for my pod in general. But then volume mounts is the final indication of, okay, this container wants to attach to the specific volume. So that's what volumes do. In our networking case, that's not the case. We have a single network namespace. There is no per container capability. So basically, the configuration is not done on that level. It's done on the level of the whole pod, not on the level of per container. So what I'm saying is to add something called a pod network attachment, which will be on a level of the containers. So maybe I can do this. Let me just quickly fix this. So there is a containers here. Like this, and on a level of containers, there is another field called pod network attachment, which will be optional to specify, and it will hold a list of pod network attachments. Now, what can we specify? We can specify the name of the network I want to attach, optionally the interface name of what I desire the pod should have, and whether the specific pod network is primary. Primary means this is the default gateway interface inside the pod. Thing is, with those two other fields, those are fields that would have to be understood by CNI. So what this means, it's not enforced by anyone. This cannot be enforced by the core Kubernetes, by kubelet, or by any means. So basically, the question would be: are those fields valid here? Because those will be, what I want to say, dependent on whether the implementation supports it. So I can have those fields, but whether they really work, I don't know. I have to look at my implementation, whether it supports it or not. That's what it will mean. So that's something that I think like folks from the SIGs might be reluctant for us to have, since there is no way to enforce them. So that's something that keep in mind that when we're discussing this part. How would this look like? This is an example, containers, and then we have pod networks, and then there is basically a list of a pod network, name of the pod network. It can have optionally name, and let's say this is a pod network default, and that's how it will look like. The thing here is, if I specify any network, and this is something that we mentioned before, but this list is explicit. So what it means is there is no assumed anything. There is no assumptions that default pod network is listed. No. If I say I only list the data plane pod network, I am going to attach only to the data plane network. Okay, very explicit. So basically, if I want to attach to the default and the data plane, I have to explicitly list the default. And the other thing will be if the pod network is not defined, the KCM, this is what I was talking about, the default pod network, and this is what I was referring to, the autofill. So basically, when multi-networking is enabled in the cluster, the KCM would automatically populate this field, probably without the interface name, but with the primary true and the pod network value true, the default or the override from the node, depending on what is set, right? So basically, this field would always be when the pod is finally in the cluster. This field will be set with this at least one field over here. Questions, comments? I think we are at the
before closing the meeting. I just adding the comments. So the what you talking about is not in this document. Please adding.
What do you mean? Oh,
So-
additional. Yeah, probably.
So the interface name is given the from
yeah. That part.
right.
Yeah, I need to probably
And then the
add
default, the attachment, the manipulation of the regarding the default is also
agree.
made.
That has to be the text.
So
has
maybe
to
that
be
this is
expanded
pretty
over.
help to us to proceeding in the next meeting to discuss about that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I will expand the text for that by end of the week. Yes. I will try to do it. Alexander?
I'm new, so maybe my question is a bit dumb, but can we just put 2 words on how you would track the references to a specific pod? So you say that if there are no references left, it's going to be put in the state that nothing's using it, but how are you going to track what is referencing that?
That will be indicated by so basically the in use are you referring back to the in use flag?
Yeah, exactly. I didn't want to interrupt. So I was wondering how we're going to keep, so every object is going to somehow subscribe or unsubscribe from that, so to say in simpler words. So you said that you track references to that, and when there are none, it's just not going to be in use anymore. It's going to be marked in some way, but what's going to keep track of this? So how is one object?
There will be a what I'm thinking is having and it's up to implementation. How can that be done? But one idea would be we will have a controller for the pod network in general. So basically, as soon as and that controller will have to watch pods. And basically, as soon as the pod comes up, I look at its pod networks and see what are being referenced. And then the controller will go to that explicit pod network and indicate in use. So that's what I'm thinking of that the controller will do. It's on every pod network. It will trigger reconciliation for all the networks that specific pod is using. So basically, let's assume I'm applying this pod into the cluster, and my controller is based on network. So now I'm looking at the names here that you reference in this list, and I'm going to trigger my reconciliation for those 2 networks, which then will list all the pods and see, okay, which pods are using me. If there is at least one, okay, I quit and say in use and carry on. And I do the same for all the networks, right? All the reconciliation. I'm not sure how much you're familiar with Kubernetes controllers.
I was just wondering how you think of implementing that. It's clear that I was just wondering if there could be some smarter way in order to do that, but
there could be an indication of incrementation and decrementation. That's always kind of tricky, incrementing and decrementing, because that one then you might
you can have race conditions in that.
Yeah, and lose track of that. So that's a tricky piece. Daniel?
Yeah, so I was just totally. So if we can quickly go to the definition on the pod network, just a little bit higher. Yeah, on the pod network attachment, that's cool. But and maybe again, I'm losing context. But shouldn't we also be tracking which CNI plugins are we going to be using with data specific network attachment?
So no, so that's done in the pod network. Yeah, you're missing that part. So here is an example. Pod network has that reference here. If it's not about Daniel, it's not about the CNI, it's about your implementation of how it's gonna be done, right? So it's whether this pod network references to a specific CNI or however you want to implement that, that's up to the implementation. It's not up to this. It's keep in mind this pod network is not one-to-one reference to a CNI configuration. It's not. That's one of the implementation that you can have, but it's not exactly that. Okay.
No, I mean, besides that, like it sounds like pretty much what you could do. It's basically a name, pretty much it, and the interface.
And your implementation can take the name of the pod network and reference it to a CNI config. If that's what you wish to do, you can do that as well. Yes.
No, that's cool. But I mean, I was also thinking that it may be a little bit confusing because you may be, basically like mistaking that by the CNI name actually. But if you also got that in a wrapper, then that's cool.
Yeah, you have the kind of capability to kind of go all the ways. All right, folks, I think we are at the time. Let's start finalizing. I am going to be off for the next 2 weeks, so I will update the text about this pod network. If you're gonna have more ideas on what to do, please note them in this. I think most of you have edit rights. If you don't, I think most of you have edit rights here, so you should be able to just add text here, leave comments. It's by any point this doc doesn't belong to just me. This is all this whole group effort. So feel free to just add here or leave comments for whatever you're going to discuss for the next 2 weeks. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Totally.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, have a nice one.